Sophia Chen was not like the other children in her neighborhood. While kids her age ran through the streets of their small town outside Shanghai, playing tag and riding bicycles, 6-year-old Sophia found herself drawn to something else entirely. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she would press her ear against the thin wall that separated her family's apartment from their neighbors, listening intently as Mrs. Liu, a retired piano teacher, practiced Chopin's nocturnes and waltzes. There was something about those sounds, the way they rose and fell, how they could be both powerful and delicate at the same time, that spoke to something deep inside Sophia. She didn't have words for what she felt, but she knew she wanted to be closer to that music. Her parents, Li and Wei Chen, worked long hours at the local textile factory. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they noticed how their daughter would hum the melodies she heard through the wall, how her small fingers would tap out rhythms on the dinner table. One evening, Wei found Sophia sitting in front of their old television, watching a classical concert with such focus that she didn't hear him call her name twice. "She has music in her," Li said that night as they lay in bed, their daughter asleep in the small bedroom next door, just like my mother did. The next month, Wei surprised everyone by bringing home a battered upright piano he'd found at a second-hand shop 3 towns over. He'd spent 6 months' worth of savings and had to borrow his cousin's truck to transport it. The piano was old, some keys slightly yellowed, and it needed tuning, but to Sophia it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Mrs. Liu, hearing the out-of-tune notes through the wall, knocked on their door the following day. "If you're going to have a piano," she said with a slight smile, "someone should teach the child how to play it properly." And so began Sophia's journey into music. Mrs. Liu was strict but kind, teaching Sophia the basics, how to position her hands, how to read music, how to practice efficiently. What surprised the elderly teacher wasn't just how quickly Sophia picked up these fundamentals, but how she seemed to understand the emotional heart of even simple pieces. "Most children play notes," Mrs. Liu told Sophia's parents after 6 months of lessons. "Your daughter plays music." By the time Sophia turned 8, she had outgrown what Mrs. Liu could teach her. The old woman made some calls to former colleagues in Shanghai, and soon Sophia was taking the 2-hour bus ride into the city every Saturday morning for lessons at the community music school. Her new teacher, Professor Zhang, had studied at the Shanghai Conservatory in his youth. He was the first to recognize that Sophia wasn't just talented, she was exceptional. "She has what we call perfect pitch," he explained to her parents. "She can identify or reproduce any note by ear, but more than that, she has an intuitive understanding of music that can't be taught." The problem was money. Lessons at the community school were affordable, but for Sophia to truly develop her gift, she would need better instruction, more practice time, and eventually, a better piano. The Chens were already stretching their finances thin. Life took an unexpected turn when Sophia was 9. The factory where her parents worked closed down, forcing the family to move in with Wei's brother in Shanghai. It was a difficult period, 5 people sharing a small apartment, her parents taking whatever work they could find. But being in Shanghai meant Sophia was closer to the music school, and her uncle's apartment building had a community room with a decent piano that she could practice on. During this challenging time, music became Sophia's refuge. While the adults worried about money and jobs, she would lose herself for hours in Beethoven and Mozart. Professor Zhang, seeing her dedication despite her circumstances, began giving her extra lessons for free and lending her books and recordings from his personal collection. "There's a competition coming up," he told her when she was 11, "for young pianists across the province. I think you should enter." Sophia was terrified at the thought of playing in front of judges and an audience, but Professor Zhang insisted. "Music isn't just for practice rooms. It's meant to be shared." The day of the competition, Sophia wore her only nice dress, a blue one that had once belonged to her cousin and had been altered by her mother to fit her small frame. Backstage, the other competitors seemed so polished and confident, many from wealthy families who had been taking lessons at prestigious music academies for years. When it was her turn to play, Sophia's hands trembled as she approached the grand piano, larger and more intimidating than any she had played before. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, beginning the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Something shifted. The nervousness faded and there was only the music. She didn't win that day, placing 5th overall, but something more important happened. A judge from the Shanghai Conservatory approached Professor Zhang afterward. "Who is teaching this girl?" he asked. "I am, when she can afford lessons," Professor Zhang replied. The judge handed him a card. "Have her parents call me. There's a special program for talented students from low-income families. She would qualify." By 12, Sophia was enrolled in the junior program at the Shanghai Conservatory, her tuition covered by a scholarship. For the first time, she had access to proper facilities, practice rooms with well-maintained pianos, theory classes, and instruction from top-tier teachers. The family had also moved to a small apartment closer to the conservatory, with Wei finding work as a maintenance supervisor at a hotel and Li taking on sewing jobs from home. The transition wasn't easy. Many of the other students came from musical families or had been groomed from toddlerhood in expensive private academies. Some looked down on Sophia with her second-hand clothes and her provincial accent, but her playing silenced most critics. By 13, she was performing Liszt's Hungarian rhapsodies with a technical proficiency that students years older couldn't match. Technique is not enough, her new mentor, Professor Lin, would remind her. Anyone with enough practice can play the notes correctly. What makes a true artist is the ability to make the audience feel what the composer felt. So Sophia didn't just practice scales and arpeggios, she read poetry and visited art museums. She listened to recordings by the great pianists of the past, not to copy them but to understand the different ways music could be interpreted. On weekends, when other teenagers were at the mall or watching movies, she would often sit by the Huangpu River, watching the interplay of light on water, finding rhythms in the movement of the crowds, and translating those impressions into how she approached her pieces. By 15, Sophia had won several regional competitions across China. Critics began to take notice, with one reviewer from a Shanghai music magazine writing, "There is an old soul in this young girl's playing, a depth of understanding that belies her years." But despite these successes, Sophia remained relatively unknown on the international stage. China had produced many technically brilliant pianists in recent years, and standing out in such a crowded field was difficult. Major international competitions were expensive to enter, requiring travel costs that the Chen family couldn't afford. Even with Sophia's small earnings from local performances, everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sophia was practicing in her usual room at the conservatory, working through a particularly challenging passage of Liszt's La Campanella. Unknown to her, Professor Lin was giving a tour to a visiting American music producer who specialized in finding talent for international broadcasts. The producer stopped outside the practice room, listening to the cascade of notes coming from inside. "Who is that?" he asked. "One of our scholarship students," Professor Lin replied. "Sophia Chen. She just turned 15. "The control in those runs is remarkable," the producer said, opening the door slightly to peer in. "And she plays with such honesty." 3 weeks later, Professor Lin called Sophia's parents. "The prestigious Young Virtuosos television competition has announced auditions," he explained, his voice unusually excited. "It's broadcast in 27 countries. I've submitted a video of Sophia performing La Campanella without telling her. I didn't want her to be nervous. They've accepted her as a contestant." That evening, when Sophia returned from her practice session, she found her normally reserved father in tears and her mother frantically looking up flight information to Berlin, where the competition would be held. "But I'm not ready for something like this," Sophia protested, panic rising in her chest as her parents explained what had happened. "The best pianists from around the world will be there. And now you will be there too," her mother said simply, squeezing her hand. What terrified Sophia most wasn't the competition itself, but the judges, particularly Anton Volkov, the world-famous conductor known for his brutal criticism of young performers. She had watched clips of previous year's broadcasts, wincing as he dismantled confident young musicians with a few cutting remarks. As the departure date approached, Sophia practiced harder than ever, often staying at the conservatory until the janitors kindly but firmly told her they needed to lock up. Her fingers moved faster. Her dynamics grew more nuanced, but a gnawing doubt remained. Was she truly good enough? Or would she freeze under those bright studio lights with millions watching her every move? The nig Aged before their flight, Sophia sat alone at the piano in their small living room, a significant upgrade from their first upright, purchased with her competition winnings. As her fingers moved through Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the piece she would perform for the first round, she tried to imagine Volkov's critical gaze, the studio audience, the cameras. Her hands faltered. Her father, watching from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Play it for me," he said softly, "just for me." Sophia took a deep breath and began again, focusing not on imaginary critics but on sharing the music with her father, the man who had worked extra shifts for years to support her dream. As the music filled their modest apartment, Wei Chen closed his eyes, a smile spreading across his face. In that moment, Sophia realized something important. Whether she succeeded or failed in Berlin, the music itself was what mattered. It had already transformed her life and the lives of her family in ways she could never have imagined when she first pressed her ear against Mrs. Liu's wall. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't predict. But tonight the music was enough. Anton Volkov stood at his bathroom mirror, adjusting his bow tie with practiced precision. At 63, his once jet black hair had turned silver, but his piercing blue eyes remained unchanged, sharp, critical, missing nothing. He straightened his already straight tie for the third time, a ritual born of perfectionism rather than necessity. The Berlin apartment was silent except for the faint classical music playing from hidden speakers, his own recording of Mahler's Fifth Symphony with the Berlin Philharmonic from 12 years ago. Critics had called it definitive and revelatory. Volkov himself found 3 mistakes every time he listened to it. His housekeeper had laid out breakfast on the balcony overlooking the city. Fresh bread, sliced fruit, strong coffee. As was his custom, he ate precisely half of what was served, checked his watch, and reached for the dossiers on today's contestants for the Young Virtuosos television competition. More children playing beyond their understanding, he muttered to himself, flipping through the pages of glowing recommendations and competition wins. The truth was that Anton Volkov had not always been this cynical. Born in a small village outside Moscow to a factory worker father and a mother who taught piano at the local school, young Anton had shown remarkable talent early. His mother recognized it immediately, sacrificing everything to nurture his gift. By 12, he had moved to Moscow to study at the Central Music School, living in a cramped dormitory, practicing 8 hours daily. Those years had been lonely but focused. While other teenagers discovered parties and dating, Anton discovered Chopin and Liszt. His only true friend was his roommate, Dmitri, another piano prodigy who approached music with a joy that Anton secretly envied. "You play like you're solving a mathematical equation," Dmitri once told him after a practice session. "Perfectly correct, but where is your heart?" The comment had stung because Anton knew it contained truth. He worked twice as hard after that, not just on technique but on expression, eventually earning a place at the Moscow Conservatory and then winning the prestigious Tchaikovsky competition at 22. The victory launched an international career that took him from obscurity to concert halls across Europe and America. For 15 glorious years, Anton Volkov had been among the most celebrated pianists in the world. His interpretations of the Russian composers, particularly Rachmaninoff, were considered unparalleled. He drove himself relentlessly, perfectionism fueling both his success and his growing isolation. Few colleagues became friends. Fewer relationships lasted more than a few months. There was only the music, the constant quest for flawless performance. Then came the night in Vienna. Halfway through Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, ironically, the same piece young Sophia Chen would choose years later. Anton felt a strange numbness in his right hand, then shooting pain. He somehow finished the performance through sheer will. But backstage, he collapsed. The diagnosis was devastating: focal dystonia, often called musician's cramp, a neurological condition that causes involuntary muscle contractions. For a pianist, it was career-ending. Multiple doctors, specialists, experimental treatments. Nothing worked completely. He could still play, but not at the level his reputation demanded, not with the precision his own standards required. At 38, Anton Volkov's career as a performing pianist was over. What followed was a dark period few knew about. The empty days, the failed attempts to practice, the bottles of expensive vodka. His agent stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Former colleagues expressed sympathy but kept their distance, as if failure might be contagious. It was his old friend Dmitri, now a respected conductor, who eventually pulled him back from the edge. "Your hands may be compromised, but your ears and your mind are not," Dmitri said during an unexpected visit to Anton's apartment, where he found his friend unshaven and surrounded by empty bottles. "Have you ever considered conducting?" Anton laughed bitterly. "Become one of those preening peacocks waving my arms around for show?" "No," Dmitri replied seriously. "Become someone who shapes sound in a different way, someone who teaches others to hear what you hear." The transition wasn't easy. Anton had to swallow his pride and start almost from the beginning, studying conducting technique in private lessons. His name still carried enough weight to secure him a position with a regional German orchestra, where his exacting standards initially made him more feared than respected. But something unexpected happened. As Anton worked with musicians articulating his vision for each piece, he rediscovered his passion for music itself. The orchestra improved dramatically under his leadership, their performances gaining attention. Within 5 years, he had worked his way up to more prestigious posts, eventually becoming principal conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. His reputation as a conductor soon eclipsed his fame as a pianist. He became known for transforming good orchestras into great ones. Though his methods were often controversial, musicians complained about his grueling rehearsals and cutting remarks, but none could deny the results. "Volkov doesn't conduct orchestras," one critic wrote. "He sculpts sound with the precision of a master artisan and the vision of a true artist." Behind his professional success, however, the private Anton remained isolated. His Berlin apartment was elegant but impersonal, more like a museum than a home. Casual acquaintances were many. Close friends were few. Dmitri had passed away 5 years earlier, taking with him perhaps the only person who had truly known Anton. Some nights, alone after concerts, Anton would attempt to play piano with his damaged right hand. The results were always disappointing, a painful reminder of what he had lost. Over time, he grew to resent young pianists with their perfect technique and limitless futures. He found fault with them easily, too mechanical, too showy, too safe. None of them, he believed, truly understood the music. They played with such facility. It was this complicated man who had been approached 3 years ago to serve as the celebrity judge for young virtuosos. The producers had sought him out precisely because of his fearsome reputation, hoping his unfiltered criticism would boost ratings. To their delight, Volkov had proven even more cutting on camera than in rehearsal halls. "What we just witnessed," he told one unfortunate teenage violinist during the first season, "was not Bach. It was the musical equivalent of a spelling bee, technically correct but utterly soulless." The clip went viral. Viewership soared. Volkov became the judge audiences loved to hate. For Anton himself, the show was merely a diversion, a chance to influence musical education on a broader scale. He genuinely believed his harsh criticism served a purpose, separating true artists from mere technicians, forcing young musicians to question whether they had the emotional depth their craft required. "Kindness to mediocrity is cruelty to art?" he often said when producers questioned whether he might tone down his remarks. On this particular morning, as he reviewed the contestants for the day's taping, one name gave him pause: Sophia Chen. The biography was thin, a 15-year-old from Shanghai scholarship student. Several regional competition wins, but no major international exposure. What caught his attention was the repertoire choice: Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, his piece. The one he'd been playing when his career ended. He studied her photograph, a serious-looking girl with straight black hair and intense eyes. Something about her expression reminded him fleetingly of himself at that age. The determination, the hint of vulnerability carefully hidden. Anton closed the file and checked his watch again. His car would arrive in exactly 7 minutes to take him to the studio. He rose, buttoned his tailored jacket, and walked to the piano that dominated his living room, a magnificent Steinway he could no longer play properly. With his left hand, he picked out the opening melody of the Rachmaninoff concerto, the notes still familiar after all these years. His right hand hovered above the keys for a moment before he withdrew it, closing the piano lid with a soft but decisive click. "Let's see what you understand about Rachmaninoff, Miss Chen," he said to the empty room. In the car, Anton reviewed his notes one final time. The day's lineup featured 6 young musicians, 2 violinists, a cellist, and 3 pianists, including Sophia. The producers had scheduled her for last, sensing potential for a dramatic moment with the Russian piece and the Russian-born judge. As the car pulled up to the television studio, fans and press gathered outside recognized him immediately. Flashbulbs popped. A few music students called his name. Anton nodded curtly but didn't smile as his driver opened the door. Inside, makeup artists and production assistants swarmed around him, each receiving the same cool efficiency and response. Only the show's director, Thomas, received anything resembling warmth. "Are we properly prepared for today's musical massacre?" Thomas asked with a grin as they walked toward the set. "If they play well, there will be no massacre," Anton replied. "But based on past experience, I'm not optimistic." The studio was designed to intimidate. Bright lights, multiple cameras, a live audience of 300, and a magnificent grand piano on a raised platform. The judges' table faced it directly, with Anton's seat in the center, elevated slightly above his fellow judges. As the audience filed in and the crew made final adjustments, Anton sat alone, mentally preparing. He hadn't always been this person, the feared critic, the isolated perfectionist. Once, music had brought him joy rather than merely satisfaction. Once he had played for the love of playing, but that was another life before his hands betrayed him, before disappointment hardened into judgment. The floor director approached, headset in place. 2 minutes, Maestro Volkov." Anton nodded and straightened his posture, his face settling into the stern mask that millions of viewers recognized. Whatever doubts or regrets lived within him would remain private. Today, as always, he would accept nothing less than excellence. Especially from the girl who dared to play Rachmaninoff. The backstage area of young virtuosos buzzed with nervous energy. 5 contestants had already performed, each receiving varying degrees of criticism from the judges, particularly from Anton Volkov, whose comments had reduced one violinist to tears. Now only Sophia Chen remained, waiting in the small preparation room, her hands cold despite the warmth of the studio. 5 minutes. "Miss Chen," a production assistant with a clipboard said, poking her head through the door. Sophia nodded silently, her throat too dry for words. She stood and smoothed down her simple black dress, the nicest one she owned, purchased secondhand but carefully tailored by her mother. Next to the designer outfits worn by some of the other contestants, it looked plain, but Sophia hadn't noticed. Her mind was entirely on the music. Professor Lin, who had traveled with the Chen family to Berlin, gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Remember," he said quietly, "you are not playing for him. You are playing for the music itself." Sophia's parents couldn't afford to come backstage. They had used nearly all their savings just to pay for the flights and hotel, but they had hugged her fiercely before taking their seats in the audience. Her father had pressed something into her palm, a small jade pendant that had belonged to his mother. "For luck," he had whispered. The pendant now rested against her collarbone, cool and smooth. A stagehand appeared at the door. "We're ready for you now." The walk to the stage seemed both endless and too quick. Sophia followed the stagehand through dimly lit corridors that smelled of floor polish and nervous sweat, finally arriving at the wings of the main stage. From here, she could see the gleaming grand piano under the bright lights, the judges' table beyond it, and the audience, hundreds of people, their faces indistinct in the darkness beyond the stage lights. "And our final contestant tonight," the host's voice boomed through the studio, "comes to us from Shanghai, China. At just 15 years old, she has won several regional competitions in her home country. Please welcome Sophia Chen." The applause was polite but reserved as Sophia walked onto the stage. Her legs felt wooden, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the microphones must be picking it up. She approached the piano, adjusted the bench, and then, as custom dictated, crossed to the judges' table to introduce herself. The 3 judges watched her approach. On the left sat Helene Dubois, a renowned French music educator known for her nurturing approach to young talent. On the right was Jonathan Wells, a British composer who had written scores for several award-winning films. and in the center, elevated slightly above the others, sat Anton Volkov, his expression unreadable, his posture perfect. "Good evening," Sophia said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I am Sophia Chen," Helene smiled warmly. Jonathan nodded. Anton studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Chen," he said, his accent making her name sound different somehow, "you have chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 for your performance today." It wasn't quite a question, but Sophia nodded anyway. "An ambitious choice," Anton continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed studio. "Perhaps too ambitious. This piece was written by a Russian master who understood the depths of human emotion. It requires not just technical skill but profound life experience." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell me, what could a 15-year-old from provincial China possibly understand about Rachmaninoff's soul?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Sophia felt heat rise to her face, but Professor Lin's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't let him provoke you. This is his technique, to unsettle you before you play a single note." "I cannot claim to fully understand Rachmaninoff's soul," Sophia replied carefully. "But I have lived with this music for 3 years now. I have studied not just the notes but his life, his letters, the Russia he knew. The music speaks to me, and I hope to honor what it says." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed Anton's face before his expression settled back into cool assessment. "We shall see," he said. "You may begin." Sophia returned to the piano, her legs steadier now, anger providing a kind of strength. She sat, closed her eyes briefly, and placed her hands in position for the opening notes of the concerto. In the moment before she began, Sophia thought of her journey, the little girl with her ear pressed to the wall, the hours of practice on worn-out pianos, her parents' sacrifices. She thought of Mrs. Liu, and Professor Zhang, and all the people who had believed in her when she hadn't believed in herself. Then, she began to play. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto is deceptively simple, a quiet, almost melancholy melody that gives little hint of the technical challenges to come. Sophia played these first notes with a gentleness that made them sound like a question being asked in the stillness of the studio. As she continued, her initial nervousness faded. There was only the music now, the complex emotions Rachmaninoff had woven into every passage. Sophia had no orchestra backing her today. For this preliminary round, contestants played alone, their technique and interpretation on full display with nowhere to hide. 30 seconds into her performance, as she began the first challenging run of notes, Anton Volkov's voice cut through the music like a knife. "Stop!" Sophia's fingers froze above the keys. The single word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Stop," Anton repeated, louder this time. "This is pointless." Sophia looked up, confusion and hurt warring on her face. She had barely begun. What could she have done wrong so quickly? Anton was shaking his head, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disdain. "What we're hearing is not Rachmaninoff. It is notes on a page being reproduced with technical accuracy but no understanding." He turned slightly, addressing the audience now as well as Sophia. "This young lady has clearly practiced diligently. Her fingers move where they should. But this is mathematics, not music." He gestured dismissively. There is no soul here. No comprehension of what these notes meant to the man who wrote them. The studio had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, capturing every moment of Sophia's humiliation. Rachmaninoff wrote this concerto during a period of deep personal crisis, Anton continued, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone. He had faced failure, depression, self-doubt. These notes, he mimicked a pianist's hand motion, are not merely an exercise in dexterity. They are a man's heart laid bare, his struggle to find beauty amidst pain. He fixed Sophia with a cold stare. "How could you possibly understand that?" In the audience, Sophia's parents sat rigid with shock. Her mother had grabbed her father's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Nearby audience members glanced at them with uncomfortable sympathy. On stage, Sophia remained at the piano, her head slightly bowed now, absorbing each word like a physical blow. The cameras zoomed in on her face, broadcasting her reaction to millions of viewers in 27 countries. Anton wasn't finished. "I have heard this approach before from many young Chinese pianists. All technique, no emotion, like watching a computer program execute a task." He sighed heavily. Perhaps it is a cultural difference, but music must be more than correct fingering and proper timing. At this, Hélène Dubois stirred beside him. Anton, perhaps we should allow her to continue. To what end? He interrupted. So she can demonstrate more technically perfect emptiness? I think not, he addressed Sophia again. Young lady, I suggest you return when you have lived enough to understand the music you are attempting to play. When you have experienced love, loss, despair, and triumph beyond the practice room. He waved his hand in dismissal. That will be all. The director, sensing compelling television even as he winced at Volkov's harshness, signaled for the cameras to keep rolling. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence, witnessing what felt like an execution rather than a critique. Sophia remained motionless at the piano, her fingers still poised above the keys where they had stopped. For nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in television time, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, she raised her head and looked directly at Anton Volkov. Something in her expression made him pause. There was hurt there, certainly, and embarrassment. But there was also something else, a quiet dignity, a resolve that seemed beyond her years. May I try something else? She asked, her voice clear despite everything. The question caught everyone by surprise. Contestants who received such criticism typically either fled the stage in tears or launched into defensive arguments. They didn't ask for another chance, Anton frowned. Another piece won't change my assessment of your playing. Please, Sophia said simply. One more chance. The director, sensing a potential moment, whispered urgently into Anton's earpiece. Let her try. The audience will love it, redemption angle. Great television. Anton hesitated, then gave a dismissive wave. Very well. What would you like to play instead? Sophia took a deep breath. The final movement of Scriabin's Piano Sonata No. 5. A murmur rippled through the knowledgeable portions of the audience. Even Anton couldn't quite hide his surprise. Scriabin's Fifth was notoriously difficult, both technically and emotionally, a piece that shifted between dreamlike passages and frenzied intensity, demanding not just skill, but a deep understanding of the composer's complex mysticism. More significantly, it was known that Volkov himself had attempted to record it 3 times during his performing career, but had never released a version, reportedly because he was never satisfied with his own interpretation. An interesting choice, Anton said carefully. You understand this is considered one of the most challenging pieces in the repertoire? Sophia nodded. I do. And you believe you can do it justice? Instead of answering, Sophia simply turned back to the piano, closed her eyes for a moment, and placed her hands in position for the opening of Scriabin's challenging work. The studio held its collective breath. The first notes hung in the air like a question, softer than anyone expected, drawing the listeners in. Then came the answer, a cascade of sound that seemed to fill every corner of the studio with its strange, haunting beauty. The first notes of Scriabin's Piano Sonata No. 5 spilled from Sophia's fingers like water, clear, delicate, almost questioning. Then came the answer, a surge of sound that seemed to transform the studio into something else entirely, somewhere beyond the harsh lights and judging eyes. Anton Volkov sat up straighter, his eyebrows rising slightly. He had expected a brave but failed attempt, a child trying to climb a mountain far too steep. What he heard instead was understanding. Sophia's body swayed gently as her hands moved across the keys, no longer separate from the piano but part of it. Her eyes were half closed, not in concentration but in something closer to surrender. The music flowed through her, notes cascading and then pausing, tender passages giving way to storms of sound. In the audience, Sophia's father gripped his wife's hand. Neither of them knew this piece. It was not one Sophia had played at home. They understood only that something extraordinary was happening, that their daughter was speaking a language they had never heard from her before. The television crew, professionals who had filmed hundreds of performances, found themselves captivated. Camera operators who usually followed strict shooting patterns began to improvise, trying to capture the transformation occurring on stage. The director, who had been prepared to cut away to judges' reactions, signaled to stay with Sophia, to witness whatever this was unfolding before them. Scriabin's Fifth Sonata is a piece of contradictions, dreamlike yet precise, structured yet seemingly chaotic, intimate yet cosmic. It requires not just technical mastery, but an emotional intelligence capable of holding these opposites together, making sense of what should not make sense. Sophia had discovered the piece 2 years earlier, when Professor Lin had played a recording after a particularly frustrating lesson. This, he had told her, is what happens when technique serves something greater than itself. She had been transfixed, asking to borrow the recording, then seeking out others. For months she had studied the piece in secret, not playing it but absorbing it, understanding its architecture, its heart. Only in the last 6 months had she begun to practice it, and never had she performed it for anyone until, now as she reached the heart of the piece, a passage of almost violent intensity that suddenly dissolves into whispered tenderness, Sophia forgot where she was, forgot the cameras, the audience, the judges, forgot even her own hands. There was only the music, the story it told of struggle and beauty, chaos and order, darkness and light. In the judge's booth, Anton Volkov sat perfectly still, his usual critical expression replaced by something more complex. His hands, resting on the table before him, had curled slightly, unconsciously mimicking the fingering of a particularly difficult passage. His eyes never left Sophia's face. Helene Dubois glanced sideways at her colleague, recognizing what few would. Anton Volkov was moved. The man known for his cutting remarks and impossible standards was leaning forward almost imperceptibly, drawn in despite himself. As Sophia approached the final section of the piece, a frenetic, almost ecstatic conclusion that seems to break free of earthly constraints, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Not from sadness or stress, but from the pure emotion of the music itself. The cameras caught it. This moment of perfect vulnerability and strength combined, broadcasting it to homes across the world. The final chords rang out, powerful, questioning, resolving, yet somehow still open, and then silence filled the studio, a silence so complete it seemed almost solid. For 5 full seconds no one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Then the audience erupted. People leapt to their feet, applause thundering through the space. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Others joined in, the reaction building to a roar. In the 3rd row, Sophia's mother was openly weeping, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Next to her, her husband stood tall, his face a mixture of pride and wonder. Sophia remained at the piano, hands still resting lightly on the keys, her breath coming fast but even. Slowly she turned toward the judges' table. Helene and Jonathan had both risen to their feet, joining the standing ovation. Anton remained seated, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked with Sophia's across the space between them. The audience's applause began to fade as people noticed this silent exchange, this moment between the harsh judge and the young performer. The studio grew quiet again, everyone waiting. Anton rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate. He walked out from behind the judge's table and approached the piano. The cameras followed his every step, capturing what was already becoming a moment of television history. He stopped a few feet from Sophia, who had risen from the piano bench to face him, her posture straight despite her exhaustion, her eyes clear despite her vulnerability. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice different now, quieter, without its earlier edge. He seemed to search for words, a man unaccustomed to being at a loss for what to say. "I was mistaken." The admission hung in the air, as startling in its way as Sophia's performance had been. "You have not just played the notes," Anton continued. "You have understood the music in ways that—" He paused, and those who knew him best might have detected a slight tremor in his voice, in ways that have eluded even me. Sophia looked up at him, her expression open without triumph or resentment. "How?" he asked simply. "How did you come to understand Scriabin so deeply?" Sophia considered the question carefully. "My teacher once told me that great music isn't about the composer or the performer. It's about being human, about finding the universal in the personal." She glanced down at her hands, then back to Anton's face. "Scriabin wrote about struggle and transcendence. I may not have lived as long as you, but I understand what it means to fight for something beyond yourself." For a moment, something like recognition flickered in Anton's eyes, not of her playing, but of himself, of the young musician he had once been, before cynicism and disappointment had hardened around his heart. The host, sensing a perfect television moment, hurried onto the stage, microphone in hand. "Well, I think we can say that was unexpected," he said brightly. Judge Volkov, you're not usually so generous with praise. What made this performance special? Anton turned slightly toward the host, his expression cooling. If you need me to explain it, you didn't hear it, he said curtly. Then, turning back to Sophia, he lowered his voice so only she could hear. We have much to discuss about your interpretation of the middle section. Perhaps after the competition. It wasn't effusive praise. It wasn't an apology. But from Anton Volkov, it was something perhaps more valuable. Recognition. Respect. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Sophia. The other judges' comments, glowing. The host's questions, predictable. The backstage congratulations from fellow contestants, sincere from some, less so from others. Through it all, Sophia maintained a quiet composure, thanking people politely but avoiding the exuberant celebrations the camera crew clearly hoped to capture. It wasn't until she was finally alone with her parents in their modest hotel room, the door closed against the world, that she allowed herself to fully feel what had happened. I still don't understand, her mother said, smoothing Sophia's hair back from her forehead. This was not the piece you practiced at home. How did you play it so perfectly? Sophia leaned against her mother's shoulder, suddenly very much a 15-year-old girl again, not the artist who had commanded the stage. I've been studying it for 2 years, she admitted. At first just listening, then practicing when you and Dad were at work. I wanted to wait until I could really play it before I showed anyone. Her father shook his head, amazed. But why choose it tonight? Why take such a risk? Sophia was quiet for a moment, remembering the look on Anton Volkov's face when he had dismissed her, the cutting words about her lack of understanding. Because he was right, she said finally. Not about everything, not about me having no soul in my playing. But he was right that I wasn't connecting deeply enough with the Rachmaninoff. I was too focused on getting it perfect. She sat up straighter. But with the Scriabin, I don't know how to explain it. It's like the music and I found each other, like we recognized something in each other. Her father nodded slowly, understanding in his way, though he couldn't read a note of music. Like when I first met your mother, he said with a small smile. Some connections you can't explain. You just feel. Later that night, as her parents slept, Sophia stood by the hotel window looking out at the lights of Berlin. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with messages, from Professor Lin, from friends back home who had somehow watched the performance online, even from music school suddenly interested in the girl who had stood up to Anton Volkov. One message stood out from the others. It had come through the competition's official channel, a note from Anton Volkov himself. Tomorrow, my studio. 10 a.m. Bring the scribe in questions. AV no praise. No flowery words. Just an invitation, no more of a summons, to continue the conversation they had begun on stage. Sophia set the phone down and looked up at the night sky, at the few stars visible through the city's glow. Something had shifted tonight, not just in how others saw her, but in how she understood herself. She had faced her fear, faced dismissal and criticism, and found something stronger on the other side. Whatever happened tomorrow with Volkov, whatever happened with the rest of the competition, she knew now what was possible when she played from the deepest part of herself. That knowledge once gained could never be taken away. She closed the curtains and returned to bed, her mind already filling with the music she would discuss tomorrow, not as a student desperate for approval, but as an artist with her own voice, her own understanding. For the first time, Sophia Chen fell asleep not dreaming of becoming a great pianist someday, but knowing she already was one. The morning after her performance, Sophia stood outside a weathered brick building in a quiet Berlin neighborhood, checking the address twice before approaching the door. Anton Volkov's studio was not what she had expected. No gleaming skyscraper or luxury apartment building, but a converted warehouse space in an area filled with artists' workshops and small cafes. She pressed the buzzer marked simply, Volkov, her heart racing nearly as fast as it had before her performance. A moment later, the door unlocked with a metallic click. Inside, a freight elevator with manual doors took her to the top floor. When she stepped out, she found herself in a vast open space filled with light from wall-to-wall windows. At one end stood 2 grand pianos facing each other. At the other, comfortable seating surrounded by overflowing bookshelves. The walls were covered with framed programs, photographs, and artwork, the collected memories of a long musical life. Anton Volkov stood by one of the windows looking out at the city below. He wore a simple black sweater rather than his usual formal attire, making him seem somehow more human, less the fearsome judge from television. "Miss Chen," he said, turning as she entered. "Punctual, good." He gestured toward the pianos. "Shall we begin?" No small talk. No mention of yesterday's drama. Just straight to the music. Sophia nodded, placing her bag carefully on a nearby chair and removing her well-worn score of Scriabin's Fifth Sonata. "You won't need that," Anton said, noticing the music. "You know it already. Here, sit." He indicated the piano furthest from the windows. Sophia took her place, adjusting the bench, gathering her thoughts. Before she could begin, Anton spoke again. "First, I owe you an explanation." His voice was different here than it had been in the studio. Quieter, less performative. "My words yesterday before your Scriabin, they were unacceptable." Sophia looked up, surprised. She hadn't expected an apology. Anton continued, his gaze direct but not unkind. "I have built a career on honesty, sometimes brutal honesty about music. But yesterday I was not honest. I was projecting." He glanced briefly at his own hands. "Your Rachmaninoff was not soulless. It was cautious, yes. Perhaps too focused on technical perfection. But there was promise there." He moved to the second piano, sitting down so they faced each other across the two instruments. "I should have guided, not dismissed. For that I apologize." Sophia nodded, accepting his words with the same dignity she had shown on stage. "Thank you," she said simply. A hint of a smile touched Anton's face, the first Sophia had seen from him. "Now," he said, his tone shifting to that of a teacher, "let's discuss your Scriabin. The middle section. Play from the scherzando, if you would." And so began the most extraordinary piano lesson of Sophia's life. For 3 hours they worked on the piece, not with Anton dictating interpretations, but with a genuine exchange of ideas. He would demonstrate a passage, she would respond with her own version, and together they would discuss the choices, the possibilities, the heart of what Scriabin might have intended. "Here," Anton said at one point, playing a particularly complex section, "most pianists emphasize the top voice, but listen if we bring out the inner line instead." His fingers moved with surprising agility, drawing forth a melody that had been hiding within the cascade of notes. Sophia tried it, adding her own subtle variation. "Like this?" Anton nodded, a look of satisfaction crossing his face. "Exactly. You hear it. By the final hour, they had moved from technical details to the philosophical underpinnings of the piece. Scriabin believed music could transform consciousness," Anton explained, pacing slowly between the pianos. He saw sounds as colors, emotions as tangible forces. This piece isn't just notes on a page, it's his attempt to capture something transcendent. Sophia considered this. "That's what I feel when I play it," she admitted. "Like I'm reaching for something just beyond what words can say." Anton stopped pacing and looked at her with new interest. "Yes, that's precisely it." As their session drew to a close, Anton glanced at his watch. "You'll need to return for the next round of the competition." "Tomorrow, yes?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, I'm playing Bach's Italian Concerto." "A good choice. Clear, structured, but with room for personality." Anton hesitated, then added, "You'll do well. Whatever happens with the competition, you have a future in music, a significant one." Coming from Anton Volkov, these simple words carried enormous weight. Sophia thanked him, gathered her things, and prepared to leave. At the elevator, Anton spoke once more. "Miss Chen, Sophia, one question has been troubling me. Why Scriabin? Of all pieces, why choose that particular musical mountain to climb after my comments?" Sophia considered her answer carefully. 2 years ago, I heard a recording of you playing it." Anton's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I never released a recording of the Fifth. It wasn't released. It was a live recording from Warsaw in 1989. Professor Lin had it in his private collection. He told me it was the finest interpretation he'd ever heard, even with the—" She hesitated. "Even with the mistakes in the final movement." Anton finished for her, a complex emotion crossing his face. "I remember that performance. 3 months before my hands—" He didn't complete the thought. "So you chose it because—" "Because it moved me," Sophia said simply. "Not to challenge you or prove anything. Because when I heard you play it, I understood for the first time what music could really do. how it could make you feel like you were touching something essential. The studio was quiet for a moment, both of them absorbing the unexpected connection that had existed before they ever met. This piece of music that had meant something profound to each of them. "Tomorrow, then," Anton finally said, "play your Bach with the same courage you showed last night." The rest of the young virtuosos competition passed in a whirlwind. Sophia advanced through each round, performing with a new confidence that audiences and judges alike could sense. She didn't win the grand prize, that went to a brilliant young cellist from Finland, but she placed third overall, an extraordinary achievement for her first international competition. What no one outside a small circle knew was that Sophia continued to visit Anton's studio throughout the competition. Their sessions were not formal lessons but conversations between musicians, each learning from the other, despite the vast differences in their ages and experiences. The viral video of their initial confrontation and Sophia's triumphant Scriabin performance had garnered millions of views within days. Music blogs and classical websites buzzed with discussions of the young Chinese pianist who had tamed the Lion of Berlin. Offers began to come in, concert opportunities, interviews, scholarship invitations from prestigious music schools. Sophia and her parents approached these opportunities cautiously, guided by advice from both Professor Lin and, surprisingly, Anton Volkov himself, who proved to have a shrewd understanding of the music business and its potential pitfalls for young artists. "Build slowly," he counseled during one of their sessions. "Choose quality over quantity. Your talent is not a flash in the pan, it's a long-burning fire. Let it develop naturally." 6 months after the competition, Sophia returned to Shanghai with her parents, but with a new plan for her future. She would finish her general education while continuing her studies at the conservatory. The following year, she would begin splitting her time between Shanghai and Berlin, where Anton had arranged for her to work with select teachers from his own circle, including himself. "Your roots matter," he told her. "Don't be in a rush to leave them behind. Bring your culture, your perspective to your playing. It's part of what makes your voice unique." 5 years later, a 20-year-old Sophia Chen stepped onto the stage at Carnegie Hall for her debut recital. In the front row sat her parents, still somewhat amazed by their daughter's journey from their small apartment to the world's greatest concert venues. Beside them sat Professor Lin, now in his 70s but still vibrant, his face glowing with pride for his most accomplished student. And at the end of the row sat Anton Volkov, no longer the harsh judge from television but Sophia's most demanding champion, colleague, and friend. The man once feared for his cutting criticism had become known in recent years for his mentorship of young musicians, particularly those from backgrounds outside the traditional, classical music establishment. As Sophia began to play, a program that moved from Bach to Chopin to a new piece composed specifically for her by Anton himself, those who had followed her career thought, back to that moment of confrontation and redemption. On a television stage 5 years earlier, the video still circulated widely, used in music schools as a teaching tool about interpretation, courage, and the bridge that can form between generations through the universal language of music. Comment sections overflowed with personal stories from people who found inspiration in Sophia's courage and Anton's capacity for change. But for Sophia herself, sitting now at the piano in Carnegie Hall, that moment was simply one step on a much longer path. As her fingers moved across the keys, she felt the presence of everyone who had contributed to her journey. Her parents with their unwavering support, her early teachers with their fundamental guidance, Professor Lin with his wisdom, and yes, Anton Volkov with his demanding standards and eventual belief in her voice. She played now not to prove anything to anyone, but because music was the truest language she knew, a way to express what couldn't be said in words, to touch what couldn't be held in hands. In the front row, Anton Volkov closed his eyes, listening to Sophia play the piece he had written for her. He heard in her interpretation elements of her own personality, her thoughtfulness, her quiet strength, her ability to find beauty in complexity. But he also heard echoes of himself, of the musician he had been before disappointment had hardened his heart. Through Sophia's playing, through their unlikely friendship, he had reconnected with what he had almost lost. The pure joy of music beyond ego, beyond career, beyond acclaim. The girl he had once dismissed as soulless had, ironically, helped him find his own soul again. As the final notes of the piece faded into the perfect acoustics of Carnegie Hall, the audience held its collective breath for a moment before erupting into applause. Sophia rose from the piano and bowed deeply, first to the audience as a whole, then, with a smile of particular warmth, to the people in the front row who had made this moment possible. The journey that had begun with an insult on live television had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined, a collaboration that bridged cultures, generations, and the space between teacher and student, evolving into a partnership of equals united by their service to something greater than themselves, the enduring, universal power of music.